I'm named after a friend of my father's, who was a good friend of his, which is why I ended up with the name Thomas Tamati Hemi Poata. Tamati, anybody who knows that Thomas and Tamati are the same name. Okay. Mum wanted an English boy's name, and Dad wanted his mate Tamati Hemi. Right. He was a Hemi, of course. And so they compromised, and I became Thomas Tamati Hemi Poata. That made them both very happy.
Exactly. So where were you born?
I was born in Kyle, up north, about 3/4 of an hour from Kirikiri, north on the eastern coast there. On Whangarua Harbour is the harbour that's famous for it.
My sister was born in Kyle.
Was she?
Yes.
Oh.
And I was Kawakawa.
I should have recognised you as being quality. No. Yeah, and that's where I was born. We were quite a large family. It was about 13 or 14 of us. Okay. And then we was farmers, small holding, very small holdings, as farms were in those days, generically anyway. And we that farm saw us all virtually through, with the exception of the three youngest, myself and two brothers that came after me. We were the youngest at that time, when my father retired. But that's entirely another story. That's where I was born, and I love the place. I think it's absolutely wonderful. One day I'll be rich enough to live there. I hope. Because once they sealed the roads, of course, up in that area, all around the Bay of Islands and all that place, every man in his caravan sort of found their way up there, and it just turned it, we just spoiled it in some ways.
So, your dad was a farmer. What were your parents' names?
My father's name was Whare Poata, stroke Porter. You know, it depended who was doing the registering, how you got registered, whether you were registered as Poata or Porter. Yes. I discovered years and years later when I joined the public service, which we'll come to later on, that it matters, because I was sent to get my birth certificate. Yes. So that you could, when you did the general exam and did all the paperwork and all that. And I went to the birthdays and marriages in Wellington to get this thing, which should have been so straightforward. What's your name? Thomas Tamati Porter. She came back and said, are you known by any other name? And I said, well, it could be Poata. Good. Off she goes. She comes back and says, yes, that's you. You're P-O-A-T-A, not P-O-R-T-E-R. So Dad would have registered us, or me, under that name. So any one of the brothers and sisters in Porter or Poata, it doesn't really matter. He had his own way of doing things.
Yes. And your mum's name?
Her name was Kathleen, but everybody called her Lena.
Okay.
Or Lena, or doing the lean thing, of course. She was much younger than Dad. She was Dad's second wife. Okay. Dad was born in the early 1900s, the first part of the decade. There's some confusion about the actual date, I think. I think it's still pretty much unknown. Mum was born in about 1924, 1925. Okay. I was born in 1958. So if Dad was born at the turn of the 20th century, he was certainly keen, even still at 58. And there were two brothers who came after me. So he was very energetic in that respect.
Did you have any special family traditions or celebrations? Did you?
Not particularly. No. Nothing other than birthdays and things weren't generally made a fuss of, because there were just so many of us anyway. Yeah. Birthdays came and went. Those sorts of celebrations, those sort of rites of passage, the only rite of passage that my mother really stuck to and maintained was the 21st birthdays. She was mad about 21st, but you've got to have a 21st. You know, this is what we do. Yes. That and church weddings. Yes. Those sorts of traditions, pretty much of that generation and of that time. Yeah. Mum was always very keen that we fulfilled the traditions. And so the Christopher Beard man, whenever he came, once every several years or something, she'd get us all licked and patted down and sat on a stool to take a Christopher Beard photo, which are now the photos that we treasure most. Yes, because exactly. they're actually brilliant photos. They're so staged, they can make even the roughest of families look half decent. And we all wore our school clothes because they were the best clothes we had in those days. And Mum would do that sort of thing, you know, look human. Make like you've got some manners. Well, those rites of passage Mum was very particular about, including baptism. Right. Not christenings. She didn't think christenings were anything. Baptised, baptism. All of those rites that that generation valued.
So were they Anglican?
Anglican,
Yes.
Dad's uncle, his father's brother, was a minister, one of the first in the north there, actually.
Okay.
And he sort of was the minister in our local parish sort of thing. He had a farm as well.
Yeah.
That was Uncle Kena. He was a very interesting fellow. His life is another interesting life. But they had that sense of timing and doing things according to the season and when the time was right and all this sort of thing. And girls should be married before they're 20 or 21 because, get out of our hair sort of thing, go and nest somewhere else. And it was normal for you to be married at 21, 22, perhaps even 18. Girls couldn't wait to get out of the countryside and get to the cities with a mate and all this sort of stuff. It was what they did.
Yeah. Yes, I've seen some photos of my parents were up there, and the wedding photos were just beautifully dressed.
Oh yeah,
And
hats and gloves and handbags. And you weren't complete, didn't dare go without a hat, gloves and handbag. And all of those sort of, that traditional
niceties,
outwardness doesn't really sort of exist so much today. You can go to a wedding in shorts now and jandals virtually, and nobody would think it a bit odd, but it wouldn't have been accursed, as you would have been in those days. And they're very much more. I was writing a thing for the parish newsletter only recently about how aesthetics have overtaken the emotion of things, of a wedding. A wedding's an emotional thing, a funeral's an emotional thing. Rites of passage, 21st century, to some degree emotional things. But now we have this fascination with turning on a do. We want to do something different. Well, some of these things, I think the tradition is itself the thing, and anything different would mean that it's not what it's supposed to be, and you're not playing to the emotions of the event. Weddings are very emotional events for what they used to be for families. Now they're sort of.
How long will it last?
Well, she wants to, and he just does as he's told, to keep the peace, and all that. It's a change in social, in the social media. It's people have far more freedom now, and because of that, people are far more disposable. In just about any context, whether it's your life partner or your wife or your girlfriend or your husband, relationships tend not to be as solid. And it is a tremendous benefit in that as well. But I think it behoves, a certain sort of responsibility to make sure you're doing the right things with the right people before it turns to custom, because it's the emotional impact and all the things that happen in people's heads and hearts later on can be very damaging. And it's not just a schoolboy or schoolgirl, spat. It's deeply emotional, often involves children, and certainly involves more than one family.
Yes.
So those rites of passages, yes, Mum was as was the whole family. I think families then were more set by the seasons, the times of life and the things that you celebrated, and how you celebrated them.
So moving on from the family itself to schooling and where you went to school, because I think I've heard that you ended up moving away from there for part of your schooling, but along with your schooling, were there subjects you liked, or were you involved in sports, were there hobbies, or was it just life on the farm and everyone was pulling their weight in bits?
I was still very young when Mum and Dad sold the farm.
Okay.
They sold the farm and we moved from Kyle to Whangarei, where they retired into Ordination. And I was about 9 or 10 then, I think, when they sold the farm.
Yeah.
So as to the working part of it, you saw stuff being done, but you tended not to have to do it. We did our little bits in our little sheds, but it certainly wasn't as much as the older brothers and the older family had to work. There was always something that could be done, whether it was just bringing wood in, those simple things that kids could do. And you were expected to be there where the work was being done, even if you just mucked around. That wasn't going to last much longer. They retired, and so I started at primary school in what was then Kiowa District High School. Now it's when the district high school system was going. Now I think it's Whangarua County College or something, whatever these things are. And in the front was the primary school, and in the back was the Form 1s up sort of thing, in the back blocks of the school. It was a wonderful place. Everybody knew everybody. We were all farmers' children, all shopkeepers in the town. You know, everybody. It was a wonderful place, I think, for us to grow up, to have continued growing up, if we had.
Yes.
Then they moved to Whangarei, and they brought home. Then I went to finish my primary school in Ohinemutu, and then started intermediate at Whangarei Intermediate. Then at the end of the first term, I came down here to Rotorua to stay with my sister and her husband, my brother-in-law. That was Mavis and her husband, Jimmy Attenborough. And they were renting a batch out at Whamauri, out at Kete.
Okay.
We were in that house for 2 or 3 years, I think it was. Then they moved into Isles Road to the old chook farm.
Oh, okay.
It had been, the chook farm had been disestablished then. All the sheds and things were still there. It ran completely between Isles Road and Baisley Street.
Yes.
Or Baisley Road.
Yes.
That entire block was this chook farm. It was a great place to sort of roam around.
Yeah.
And because there was nothing there. The fruit trees had all grown up and the chickens had all gone long ago. It was absolutely wonderful. And a beautiful old home, which is long since gone. It's all been developed out there.
Yes.
And then they built a home out in Homedale Street, one of the first homes out in Homedale Street, when it ended about, 500 yards from the Evan Road corner. Right. Now it reaches right up into the back, into suburbs there, I don't even know their name. And that was the school. Now I did Sunset Intermediate, right, when I came down here to live here, and Rotorua Boys High School.
Okay.
And I was in Raleigh, because all the best looking people were in Raleigh House. And the sports people, you know, I was hopeless at sports. I was absolutely useless. No, you're not going to see my name on any of the walls in the hall.
So you're not over there.
I'm not running around with a wall. I did tell the story about the late John Morrison of Rotorua fame. He was the phys ed teacher there, as was Joe Woods, and their erstwhile brother-in-law, in one way or another. What's his name? Dave Dorset. And you'd go out there, and we'd say to Mr. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, where do you want us, whether it's cricket or rugby or soccer, whatever it was? And he'd go, as far away from me as possible. Okay, so we all three would go down, stand under a tree down there somewhere, while other people ran around seriously trying to catch a very hard cricket ball. And there were some other wonderful families too in our group. I schooled with Anthony Whareaitu, who went on to do many things. Nero Pānapa, he was in our class, and myself. I think we were the only Maori boys, I think, in that group. But there was the Ludgates, the Speddings. Mark Bowick was in our group, so that was very dispiriting. He was absolutely, he was a walking genius, you know. He could just look at a thing and he just gets it just like that, you know. It got to the point where the teachers were saying, not you, Mark, because his hands were up before the teachers had even finished asking the question. They were a great mold, those people. A lot of the old families too from Rotorua. Speddings, Ludgates, all that crowd, the pharmacy. And then I finished there, finished schooling there, and went back to Whangarei, back to my parents.
Okay.
And got my first real job, earning $25 a week.
Yes?
As a storeman, really, and part-time shop assistant, part-time window washer, sort of thing, at a shop called, what was it? Smith's Glass. In Rathbone Street in Whangarei. It was they owned it, the people who owned it, that owned the business. It wasn't associated any longer with Smiths, but they kept the name. And in the mornings I'd come in and then sit on a wee stool on a rail, and there were 4 or 5 drums of linseed oil, of turpentine, and all these other things, and I'd get these bottles and fill them and whoosh them on in and put them for the tradespeople who'd come in for their dinners and all this sort of carry. And it was a framing shop and all sorts of things that we put there. What do you call it? That kit-set furniture. House shops used to be one time in small towns. You know, you could go in and buy a milkshake and a hammer if you felt you needed a hammer from the milkshake shop. It was wonderful. That was my first job. Then my sister said, "Why don't you come down to Wellington?" Because her brother-in-law was the postmaster, I think it was Cuba Mall or Manor Street or something, and joined the public service, which I did. After about a year in Whānau, and another great place that I loved. It was a wonderful town. It was then. It's changed considerably now. And I went down to Wellington, joined the public service, and lived with them in Wainuiomata for 1 or 2 years. Joined the Post Office Savings Bank in Willis Street. Learned what it was to drink excessively and to smoke and do all of those things independent of anybody telling me I can't, you're not allowed, you shouldn't. And I absolutely loved it. I could find my way anywhere around Wellington if there was a threat of a party. And there were a number of us who were very, very good at that. And I spent a couple of years there. Then I wanted to transfer back to Auckland, so I did. I transferred back to the Auckland POSB down at Central, which is now a big train station. And lived with my sister, another one of the sisters, out at Glennie Avenue in Massey with Lorraine. Stayed out there for I think it was a year or 2 again, and then went flat in Mount Eden. Everybody ends up in Mount Eden sooner or later in a flat. And then a bunch of us or a few of us, got together and decided we'd go see the world, so off we went.
First stop? And first stop?
Australia. And just about the last year. There were all sorts of intermediate things that happened, you know, but Aussie became the home base virtually after a time. Well, and I didn't come out of school with honours and this, that and the other thing and 6th form certificate and all that. No. I didn't want to break the mould. I wanted to be like everybody else in the family.
So, how long did you spend in Aussie then?
Oh, on and off it would have been it was nearly 20 years. Do you know, I can't even remember, because in between about 78, 79 and 83, 84, it's a sort of blue haze, because there was all sorts of things going on, all sorts of excitement. It would have been the early 80s. Then there were other trips around the place and that sort of thing, but basically we stayed there. We went up to Brisbane to try and give Brisbane a go. What a hot place. I couldn't stand it. It was just I think once you've become acclimatised, of course, it's a different thing. And it was such a long way. We were in, I can't remember the name of the suburb now, but it's way out in the sticks. Not the sticks, it's still part of metropolitan Brisbane, but it was way out there. It took an hour and 20 minutes or something on the train. You know, it stopped at every stop. That was just too hard. So we came back to Sydney, got jobs, and lived a life really.
So, you're in Australia, and what sparked your move into the priesthood? It sounds like you're kind of living the life with...
I had a wonderful life. I've never left the church.
Right.
You know, I'd always been interested in it. Even when we were in Whānau, when Mum and Dad retired, I used to go to church with some people from halfway up the street, the Trinders, and they took me to church with them, and you learn your verses and all these sorts of songs, John 3:16 and all those by heart things. I think they were Baptist.
Okay.
I can't recall now, but it was used the little wee community hall down behind the shops in Onerahi there. That's where we used to meet. And they were wonderful people. And so gentle and all that sort of stuff. But deliberate, you know. They had fun as well. And I used to love it. That used to be one of the highlights of the week. And Mum would scream out, "Tom, go to church!" I'm not quite sure what she meant to go to church. She was pretty exacting about Tom, but go to church, while the other 2 brothers just lay in bed. So off I go, off to church, and I loved it, and I always did. Then when I went to Sydney, and I used to go to church every now and then, when I went to Sydney, I knew that there was a community there, a fairly strong community there. And at that time was headed by George Sutherland, who was one of the senior Maori there around about that time. There were Maori from all over the place. The first boatloads were mostly entertainers, but certainly later on in the 60s, as people left the small farms like we did and had to abandon them because they were no longer viable, that great urban and
global,
pan-global sort of, everybody started going everywhere, which was never possible before. Even though they went by ship in the earliest days, even over to Australia, everybody went there by ship, unless you were rich and could afford to fly. So Maori ended up as part of that as well, although there'd always been some degree of movement between the two places on ships and things, as crew on whalers and other things for donkey's years that had gone on. But suddenly there was almost a whole upheaval of a whole generation. They all were going somewhere, and it wasn't back to the farm, it was to towns and cities and things. The migration from Ngāti Porou, from the east coast to Wellington, to the factories and things in the Hutt Valley, where they made cars and carpets and all manner of things, when we had manufacturing of a kind. And that was a great thing that happened to those small communities. On the other hand, on the other side of the coin, whole places became virtually ghost towns. Only the rich farmers or people who could afford to buy the farm next door, and you ended up with the concentration of property in only a very few hands, and huge, by comparison to what we had, huge holdings. You could put a whole family of kids through school, as my mum and dad did, on those small holdings. Life was not about luxury, but you always had good, clean food on your plate. But it was about work. You had to work to eat. No work, no eat. It was as simple as that. The transfer to the city or urban environment did an enormous amount of... It increased optimism, but it really just made us a generation of factory workers. And in places like Auckland, where they built entire suburbs to house the factory workers, and there were no bus services, there were hardly any shops, and there was a pub, inevitably. Places like Rotorua that were built so that they could sluice Ponsonby and give it back to the rich people, and all that. So when all of a sudden moving back into the city meant something, and all of a sudden everybody wanted to move back. So clear all those factory workers out, and undivide those places. When you had 4 flats in some of those beautiful big old homes, remember those? And even Mount Eden, that house was cut in half, and you had 2 flats. Well, that impact, I think, was enormous. And it's part of that being dislocated deliberately. It's your own choice to relocate or to locate somewhere else. And then trying to rebuild another community. And I don't think we ever quite made it. Wellington sort of had Ngāti Pōneke under King Ihaka, Reverend King Ihaka. And he did all that sort of... A lot of the work was done by social groups. The social dancers up at Kaiwa Pass, up at the Kaiwa Pass church there. And all the young Māori gravitated there because they could bump into other young Māori and presumably get girlfriends and boyfriends while you're at it, And that sort of social aspect was tremendous. And a lot of weddings came out of those socials, those kinds of dances, which used to take place in the war memorial halls. Out in the rural areas. Out in the rural areas. You married the girl who lived 12 farms away. And you took over Dad's farm or some such a thing, and it stayed. That cycle's changed. I think it changed us indelibly, really, right up until now. But the Trans-Tasman traffic, I think, was far more interesting because whilst the momentum in New Zealand for the Maoriising or re-Maoriising of some aspects of New Zealand society, or the way we live and how we use place names and all these sorts of things, had started, the awareness that was brought about by the early gang movement, Black Power and others, I think they were a bad imitation of an American nightmare, which is still going on. And with those things, I used to chew them over in my brain and wonder, why is it like this? Where can this possibly go except down the drain? Which I think, and not because I'm clever, which I think it has, that there's a huge raft of people who have disappeared into meaninglessness and into institutional life of the worst kind. And so, that's where the issues of justice and I'm sorry to beat that same old drum, but at some point we have to wake up to the idea that we're responsible for ourselves in large part, and that no one can make us take the medicine. We need to make the decision to take the medicine and do whatever we need to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's real tino rāti design. Anyway, off I went to Australia, and I loved it. You get there, nobody cares who the hell you are, or where you're from, or why you wear your hair, your clothes, those particular things around the place. Nobody cares about you in Australia. And I thought it was marvellous. And you could ride on a train, and it's the proverbial, you could hear 12 languages in 10 minutes,
Yes.
and people, you could eat whatever you wanted from any part of the
Yes.
world. And just you would go to any church and see how other people do stuff. There was a special broadcasting service that broadcast in all sorts of languages and overseas films. It wasn't until about then that I discovered that French people make French movies. And the Swiss people can make pretty good movies. They've got some fantastic movies. I thought, don't tell me these people, how do they get by without Hollywood? Well, they don't need Hollywood, they've got their own. And there's some fantastic stuff. We're fed middle American bubblegum nonsense. And art is just sort of everywhere. And I think it opened my eyes, really.
Yeah.
And then you go there and you see it for yourself, eventually. But I loved Australia. I still have a tremendous respect for it. I took out my citizenship while I was there in 1988 in the bicentennial year. Incidentally, because of the coming of King Ihaka, his appointment as Maori missioner, or the missioner to the Maori people, broadly in Sydney. And he was appointed by the church authorities here to do that work, and it was funded by the Anglican Church. The Catholics subsequently did too. They sent Father Condon, I think he was from Ohinemutu, over there to look after the Catholics, because I think they feared that perhaps they'd be swamped by the Anglican, all the Catholics would be hailing King instead of Mary, and he got a bit worried about that sort of thing. So, but originally they said when they had a meeting, how we're going to know the thing. Oh, how about the Māori Anglican Fellowship or something? Those corny old-fashioned names. Yeah. And he was quite adamant that it couldn't be Anglican. He wanted something ecumenical.
Okay.
So he chose the name Arohanui. So it became the Māori Arohanui Fellowship. And so he rang me one day. I had heard, I didn't get to his pōhiri, which they had in Liverpool and Sydney. I didn't get there, but he rang me eventually. Somebody gave him my number. And he rang me, he says, "That's you, Tom Poata." And he's very imperious, how he sounds on the telephone. And he says, "You, Tom Poata?" "Yes, it is." And he said, "Now, I need to see you as soon as possible." I said, "Oh, okay. How about whenever it was?" And so off I toddled over to see him. And he said, "Now, your family and the church and the guild trip and all these sorts of things, how you've got responsibilities and all those sorts of things." So I sort of went to church there with them in Redford. Eventually, when we got given that church, it was given by the Apostolic Church, who had no longer any use for it, because it was in Elizabeth Street there, where it goes up towards Strawberry Hills and round the back end of Oxford Street and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, and down that end there, and their congregation had died away, and so they gave it to the Anglican Church, and the Anglican Church gave it to us, which was very fortuitous. It was very nice. Right smack bang in almost in the middle of Sydney. And I ended up doing all of the things that one does in a church community: secretary, treasurer, bottle washer, all that sort of thing. And do as you're told, fetch and carry when you're told, and what you're told. All that. You just do all that sort of stuff. And then eventually, in King came back to New Zealand. He wasn't very well. I think he'd been there about 2 or 3 years. And then he came back to Auckland, and he was replaced by Jim Tahiti, again from the north, from Kaikohe, from Rahiri rather, and he'd come out of Christchurch. That was his ministry down there. and he came over to he and his wife Charlotte. And then after them was Rangahau-Taonga from here, who's now our bishop. He was the third appointment to Sydney to run that ministry. Yeah, it was wonderful. It was great fun. And then, of course, we had all sorts of contacts with people in the community because of that. And we ended up, some of us ended up spending most of our lives driving from one end to the other of Rotorua, of Sydney, helping at tangies. Somebody dies. And Maori, this is where you sort of get a bit bullyish. We're keen on the idea of taking the body home still, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
Provided, of course, you don't live on the 16th floor of a building, and provided there are no Muslims or Jews who live in the building as well, because they will not react well to a dead body being ferried in and out of them. And we had to virtually say to people, we have to come to terms with the need of our rites of passage, as you described earlier on, and their appropriateness in that environment, given that there are other people there for whom a dead body is an absolute no-no. It's to be buried as quickly as possible within 12 hours or 24 hours. And they are religious about that structure. It's not a cultural thing, it's a religious thing, and there's quite a difference between what is a favoured tradition and what is faith and religion. You end up hitting a brick wall. So we had all sorts of discussions about these sort of things. We used to go around and help people, just help them through the tangi process. You'd go up to the northern beaches or something, and there's a person in a flat or a house that's died, and there's all these Maori people standing outside and going, why are you standing out here? Oh, we're waiting for somebody to take us in. I said, oh, for goodness sake. You're going to stand out here until some unsuspecting person comes along who can say kia ora and take you in. That's where the tradition started to get in the way rather than be helpful. So we did all sorts of things like that. And just tried to keep the community together and interested and concerned about itself. King Ihaka said some wonderful things during his homilies, his sermons and things. And one of the things that stuck with me, and I don't know whether he said it, or whether it's his saying, or whether he heard it or read it or adapted it from somewhere else, but it went something like, not all things Pākehā are bad, and not all things Māori are good. And I thought there's a wisdom in that really needs to be espoused. Pākehā aren't all bad. Most of them are, but not. You know what I'm saying? And so there's an element of truth in it, and it's a good starting point when you start looking at justice. And if you look at justice, you have to look at both sides, because that's what justice is. What degree of culpability and what degree of responsibility. Somebody's culpable, but somebody's ultimately responsible. All that sort of stuff. And I think that encouraged me to look at life differently. And what it is to be a Maori and all these sorts of things. It opened up all sorts of, and King and I used to have some heated discussions. I almost stopped the car once and said, "Get out, you old goat." Because he could or he could widen you. He was one of the most exciting, vibrant people, and his thinking was in my mind, it was absolutely extraordinary. His breadth of general knowledge, his capacity to cope in any environment. This would be marvellous to be able to be like this. He could walk with kings and queens and still be a humble Māori from Te Kao. And they all learnt hymn singing when they were younger. He and his sisters and his brother Toro, and all these, they were a deeply religious family. So there's nothing wrong with religion. It didn't impede his intellect or his ability to get things done. And he did so many things, including the establishment, along with many others, it has to be said. These things tend not to happen just because one person did it. It needs a chain reaction. And
you need that spark sometimes.
Absolutely. And he was able to do that with the Polynesian Festival, which has morphed over the years and become Matatini. All these things don't come about by accident. Somebody has to till the soil, get it right, try and determine what's the best climate and how do you water this thing so that it grows and grows in the right direction. And he was particular about where things were meant to go. he liked to, he was very methodical in that he would think. He never put his foot one in front of the other unless he knew exactly where it was going to land. And that's how you get things done. I miss him terribly.
So how did you then, did he push,
No,
was he a product?
he had long gone. It was during Rahukartene's ministry there in the 90s. He suggested that maybe I should think of becoming a lay reader. And there were already lay readers there. Stephen James, Johnson James, one of the Jameses from here, he was one. He was already one. So I said, no, well, okay, I'll do that, but that's enough, just to assist, around the altar and all these things, carries on. And because it never occurred to me that it was of any use anyway. And Kenny himself, he said, when he was living in the house in Five Dock, I was over there one day he happened to say something to me. He said, it was an odd thing, he had his walking stick, or the stick that his talking stick really, there beside it, and I used to do the typing. And I said to him, Paio Tototo, can you move your stick? And he says, you do it. And I said, you do it. It's your stick. And he says, ooh, he says, you, old-fashioned. I wouldn't touch it, and he wanted to see whether I would, and I didn't, and I wouldn't, even if he said, that's not how it operates, the system. It's still, he was, wise beyond, he's a cheeky thing. It wasn't him. He had mentioned it, and he said to me, you would have to marry, and I said, well, that's not going to happen. Because in those days, all Anglican clergy had to be married.
Okay. Oh.
Well, might not have been in the Pākehā church, but you lot have always been a bit weird. we were more akin to Jesus, Anyway, and I thought, nah, I'll think about it. And then there was a death in Sydney, and the head of the Maori College for St John's, three heads, Maori, Pākehā and Pacific.
Yep.
And she came over, and a few others, to this important ex-fella's funeral. And then she happened to mention it to me, and Hui Vicar was there at the same time, and he mentioned it to me as well. Although he had mentioned it to me years before when he consecrated the Maori section at Rookwood Cemetery. Hui came and did that for us. It was a wonderful thing that the City Council, or whoever, the local council, gave part of Rookwood Cemetery to the Maori for our way of doing things. And so a gate was erected there.
Oh,
it's still there.
Yeah.
And I'm still tossing up whether or not when I drop dead I don't get carted off back over to there and flung about into the floor over there somewhere or something. I've had all Rose Gardens in Hamilton. Anyway, and he did a lot, did King, in that preparation work that he built on other people's things. So, the place exists because people saw a need and they responded to it. Language and all those sorts of things. But I thought that when Rahu mentioned it, or when the head of the Maori College at St John's said that we should give it some thought, or I should give it some thought, and I did. So I took 2 years off, and I drove buses for 2 years during that period of discernment.
Right.
I was not going to hurry this thing. Yes. This thing was going to take, so I had to do something completely mind-numbing, just for the purposes of paying the rent and all that sort of thing, whilst I decided about it. So, and in the end, I decided to do it, and I came back into St John's.
Yes.
Put up with all sorts of indignities, which you do in those sorts of institutions. How old was I? Probably in my late 40s.
Okay.
Was I in my late 40s? No. Well, yeah,
40s?
sort of late 40s, mid 40s-ish, somewhere around there. I can't remember. It's all a fog. And I went up there, and all of a sudden you're being treated like a 12-year-old. I'm thinking, no, this is not how this is going to work. This is not how. So, and of course, the senior Maori priest on site there at that time at the college was Honeka, Reverend Honeka. And he and I would lock horns. He locked horns with everybody. That was his style.
Right.
He did that to get people going, to really get them ticking.
Yeah.
that and he could be, you know, just plain. And we had to, and it was there I discovered that there is a new thing abroad, and it's called being Maori. And you'd better be the right kind of Maori. And there's a right kind, and there's a wrong kind, apparently. But I'm glad about that, because there are people who know what sort of Maori I should be.
Right.
And they'll tell me.
Right.
You see? And I love it, because then I go, do you think? And then that's how my life's been ever since. That there we heard, we learned about Luther King. And all these sorts of things, the justice, social justice, religious justice, all these sorts of things, God's justice, all sorts of character. And I put my thinking caps on, and I came up with my own theology, really, although socio-theology. One that says, if we're at the moment, apparently going through this process of decolonisation, then who am I ceding my authority to do that to me? And do they do it to me? Or do I choose to have it done to me? Or do I do it myself, get the manual, request the machine on Amazon, and then come home and do it myself to myself? Or do I have to give it over to somebody? And it seems that the process, as it seems to me now, the process of decolonisation is completely undoing, apparently, first of all, the language and applying social regulation. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to cede social regulation or allow other regulation, anybody's regulation, on my life or my descendants' lives. I don't have any children, but my family's children are still ours. But they're not going to cope up with purpose, not purposed for that. And what sort of Māori will you make them? Yeah. And what is a Māori anyway? It's all of that. It opens all of that up.
So you didn't come just straight here. Did you? Where did you go before you came here to Rotorua?
From St John's. I was ordained in 2003, right. Somewhere around there. Yeah. And my first appointment was to Waikato Hospital.
Okay. As
a Māori chaplain. Mm-hmm. And I was there for 2 years, and that was a real eye-opener. There were two of us, really, myself and Jack Wihana, a Māori minister from Morrinsville. And we sort of took turns at doing the shifts and things. It was full on, it was absolutely horrendous. Because it has such a large Māori catchment. Yeah. In the Waikato, all the way over to the east coast, for the serious illnesses and things. The parts of the Bay of Plenty, the helicopters were constantly going with serious. It was constant, and it was such an enormous canvas. It was just all over the place. It really quite wore me out. But it was a wonderful ministry because it put you in at the deep end and at the sharp end of the thing, and you just get on with it. And you learn very quickly how to cope with emotional things and how to set your own emotions aside and do this thing called ministry. And it's different. It's different wherever you go and whoever's in the room. And again, you see how the social encounter has changed, and the encounter in those sorts of events has changed terribly. I think to our detriment now. Somebody is about to die, and then they ring me and say, emergency, something right. So I go there, and could be a dozen people or more standing around the bed, and they all look at you. Yeah. In the old days, the courtesy would have been for somebody to say, "Tēnā koe pā, this is me, this is my family, this is our mother," and they would make you welcome into that group. Yes. But instead you just went in there and you were left high and dry, and people just pretended not to see you, because they didn't know, how do you do this thing? What happens now? Does he do magic or something? He doesn't look like the Pope, there's not enough costumery, there's no, where's the choir? And there's none of that. And so we've lost so much of that in the de-establishment of the church and faith living of that kind. We've got a new set of faiths getting around, the prosperity gospel, which I think does so much harm, even more harm. But, if We'll leave that one alone for the meantime. But and I did that for 2 years.
Right.
And then Darren O'Callaghan, who was here as the vicar here, moved on into the army as a chaplain, a military chaplain. And this position came up, and Rahu, who was then Archdeacon at Tūrangawailai, he was my immediate supervisor while I was in hospital, came and said to me, would I be interested in coming down here? Because he'd been approached, or somebody had approached him, probably Don Bennett, who heard me preach, I think, in Te Kaha at some amorangi hui that we had there. And he said, well, go and get that one.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll go and get that one then. And Rahu said to me, I'd be interested in doing that. I said, well, you know, I go where I'm told.
Yeah.
And that's what I was told, and ta-da, and I'm still here. And I did say to him, I'll give you 5 plus possibly 3. See how we go. So all of it should have been 8.
Yeah.
Because the tenure here is anything from 2 to 5.
Oh.
Rarely more than that.
Okay.
Because that's what you do, otherwise you become
Yeah.
too familiar. People start to treat you like you're normal.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes not good, because you sort of become part of the establishment and the establishment ways. And you just don't, nothing changes.
Yeah.
Or you're seen as a favourite of certain people and not others, you know, and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's a good thing. But anyway, I haven't moved, and this is my 15th year now, I think.
Okay.
So I've got 2 more years until I retire, or 1.5 years till I get 65.
Yep.
So I don't know what I might do. We'll see how we go. Because by the time I retire at 65, a flat will be $800 a week. And that'll be the worst part of town, not even a nice part. You know what I'm saying? So it's not a good thing now to be looking at retirement. And my pension is going to, well, you know, I might be able to have chocolate biscuits once a week.
You have to visit ex-parishioners for 40 days.
The ex-parishioners, the average age of my parishioners now, and I've done a sort of brief survey, is 71.
Mm.
And it cannot get any younger. It just can't, because there's no young people coming to the door. As I put them across the sanctuary there, usually in coffins, there's nobody in the back filling it up.
Yeah.
It just doesn't do that anymore. Baptisms, we used to be mad out for baptisms until I finally got frustrated by it all and said to myself, you know what, Tom, they're only doing this so they can move their kids out of general schools and into Roman Catholic schools for a better education. Because inevitably 12 years after they've been baptised, I get a call, can you send me a copy of the baptism certificate, you know, because they're applying now for some college or...
Yes.
That's all that sort of thing. And it used to be with diocesan and all those sorts of things, and Dilworth and all those. They were difficult schools to get into. I think they still are.
Yeah.
But it's even into the Catholic education is still something that I think is hugely desirable. Mm. Even if most people aren't practising Catholics anymore, or practising Anglicans for that matter. But I mean, it's part of the social function. You know, that's what we do here, and I'm quite happy to carry on doing that until I stop breathing. I've said to the small, you know, when I do stop breathing, it's not going to matter to me, so I'm not even going to go to my own funeral. Not going to go. You can all sit there and look at each other. What else?
So what else within here, within Rotorua? Because, for example, yesterday I saw you down at the Cenotaph for Armistice Day.
What were you doing down there? Were you down there?
I drove past to park my car.
Oh, you're one of those insoluble people who just couldn't care less about anything. You just drove past and turned it on.
We did ours.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I know that you were very much involved in that whole all World War I centennial celebrations that we had, and were part of the that committee that was involved in.
Yeah.
What celebrations we were having each year as part of council. So does that kind of an official part, extra sideline, or do you just kind of end up getting roped in?
I think it's
on your
it's
personality.
I think it's. I think it's a bit. I don't think it's got much to do with me being eye candy. I'm a realist. I think it's when I came here, the associations with this place meant that in this community, people used to come here, all sorts of people used to come here, party people, high people, the upper end of town and the north end of town, all these sorts of things. This place has formed lots of connections over the years, and a lot of them are through the vicar, or the incumbent at the time, so many of whom went on to become bishops in their own right. But this place is, in a way, is emblematic. I think it's even becoming more of a sort of a chocolate box church, which is the last one you want. Nobody wants a chocolate box church. Nobody who's a worker in the church wants to get a chocolate box church, because you're marrying everybody because they want the altar picture. And it's just, you know, and they're bereft of any other ideas, and you lot are silly enough to open your door for $200, so we'll use you. That sort of, I think it's part of your job is to be part of the community, to push the community's ceremonies, its rites of passage, if you like, the community's identity, to reinforce it, especially at times like that, like in commemorations and disasters and good stuff as well as bad. And to join in those sorts. And I only do it because people ask me, will you give us a hand to do this, will you give us a hand to do that, and then next thing you know, they're calling you something. You're a padre. Well, you know, so Darren ran off and joined the army, and people said to me, why don't you become a military chaplain? You know, that's a real sinecure, that one. No, because you have to do things, you have to be physically active and all that sort of stuff.
Not your thing.
No, I don't run.
So an arts padre would be
absolutely
down your life.
Well, it's all of the things that go on in this community. Because one thing about this town, and I don't know that it's particular to Rotorua, but it just seems to be, there's a group of people who just do stuff. They do some amazing stuff, community-minded stuff. You all know who they all are. And we ought to be constantly grateful for them, because they spark a response and stuff gets done, and you end up, how do you end up with a place called the Government Gardens, the building, unless somebody stuck their neck out and said, let's build one of these great big bloody things on the shakiest piece of earth we can find. And they went ahead and they did it. And now we're going through the process of reinvigorating the thing and sorting the thing. Well, you know, we've had it for all these years, and it's about time we did something to make sure it carries on for the next 200 years or 100 years or whatever it is. It's the same as this place. I mourn the day when there won't be anybody here. It will come, but it'll do something else. But I don't know what.
This is kind of bringing us almost into the natural conclusion of where I've been looking at was any final words of wisdom, because there's been heaps all through, and that the future you've kind of touched on, future for yourself and also for this place, and I suppose the church actually in Aotearoa. You're saying that here your concern is it's going to become just the chocolate box church, unless something happens. But I think it's a lot like that for so many churches, because there's people there with faith and so forth, but they're all getting older, and the younger ones aren't coming through.
No. I think
how do we?
It's a natural evolution. I don't think we'll ever be able to hold. No society has ever been totally Christian, or totally Muslim, or totally anything. It's often been imposed by authority, or by the king, or the queen, or the dictator, who these people are, or the richest fellow in town. So there is no such thing as a universal acceptance of an idea that faith of any kind has any meaning. But I think for as long as there are people who ponder the separation of people from each other on artificial or created grounds, would see that there's room for a movement called, a faith movement that says humanity has a destiny, and that destiny is tied up in our humanity and inhumanity to humans. And so we're always going to have a resort. We have to resort to a God. There's no, you can't go anywhere else with it. Lately we've done all the things, you know, we let go helium balloons, and we buy crystals and shake them around in the kitchen and put them on the fridge door and all this sort of thing. And you know, India, North American indigenous people's spirit wheels, you know, sort of stuck all over our windscreen, our rearview mirror. None of those things are satisfactory. They won't do. You have to have a personal concept of a God and an impetus to do stuff for the better, not for your own. Now see, the way that we are now is we've actually gone so existential, we're way out there, that we don't recognise ourselves anymore. We do very little work on ourselves. We're waiting for somebody to come and do it for us, to give us a map that will tell us how to do it, and it'll can make your face look like a kitten, and all this nonsense. And our young people, and misinformation and disinformation, when half of America cannot agree whether vaccination is genuine or not, or whether COVID is genuine, half of the most civilised, wealthiest country in the world, and yet it has a huge underclass of poor people, which we never hear about. We see Hollywood red carpet and New York film studios, that's all we see. But it's a tragedy. But we will always have a God. There'll always be a God in some way or other. There will always be faithful. But I don't think it'll be on the scale that it was. And we are so discredited now because of our sexual aberrations that have gone on for centuries, for as long as human beings have been around. It's not only the priesthood, but it ought not to have been even tolerated for half as long as it has been. And the movement away from God in punishment of Christians, you know what I'm saying? That's totally silly. So the idea that, you know, Jesus died on the cross, no, all you other Christians have to do it too now to assuage the guilt of this, that and the other thing, and it goes on and on and on. So Christianity has a bad rap, and not surprisingly either. I have hope that it will carry on, and that when people rediscover the idea that you know, communities can be helped by these external things, a belief in something that is greater than the self, a belief in justice, for instance, which is primarily what Jesus was about. He came to do for you what you couldn't do for yourself, and the church needs to remember that.